Hey, I would like to call to order a meeting of the Board of Selectmen for January 9th, 2017, our first meeting of 2017. We'll start by the Pledge of Allegiance. If you could all stand. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Well, you knew that. So first on the agenda, hi Jim. Hi Kathleen. Okay, first on the agenda is approval of the minutes from December 19th, 2016. Do I have a motion?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I move the approval of the minutes from December 19th, 2016, open session minutes as written.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Okay. Abstain, you weren't here, that's correct. So we have 4-0 and 1 abstention. Okay, next, moving right along, communications and announcements. First on the agenda, we have our annual update from our superb legislative team. Bruce is not here yet. Do you want to give him a few minutes? We have another communications item, or do you want to move forward and Bruce can join when he gets here? Or?
He was attending, so if we could hold off a moment.
How long? Half hour?
Well, we'll go to item B under.
Kickoff's at 9.
We'll go.
I
think it's 8.
about that.
I actually think it's 8:15.
Oh, is it 8:15?
Yeah, it's 8:15.
No.
Not that we're on a timer or anything, but. First, so what we'll do is we'll skip that one, and then we'll go down to the recycling pickup and some of the issues that we've been having with that. So we seem to be still getting a number of calls on recycling misses during the week. So I think we're going to get an update from the manager on what's being done there.
As I understand it, some of the board members have some specific complaints, certainly that they've heard. We continue to work with the contractor to improve service on a recycling basis. We have notified the contractor that from a trash point of view, so we have one contractor that picks up recycling and the same contractor picks up trash. They're actually two different relationships, which I struggle sometimes in explaining because it can be a little unusual. So the trash contract is a vendor relationship. So we have a direct relationship with the vendor, like you would in almost any other service that we have in the community. We have notified that particular vendor that we're not renewing their contract. So somewhere you'll start to hear more about that as we go through a process of selecting an alternative vendor. We'll communicate with the public. The recycling contract is actually not our contract. So for those with some history of, I certainly wasn't here, so if I misstate this, feel free to correct me. As part of a permitting process for TBI on a Holt Road, part of the agreement was that they would be responsible for picking up and hauling recycling. So in essence, our agreement is with them that the recycling would get picked out. It's a division of their company that is Northside Carting, who's a trash and recycling hauler. So we have a direct contractual relationship with Northside that we procured in the traditional way we would for trash, and then TBI has the relationship with Northside to pick up the recycling. So we don't have the direct traditional vendor relationship with Northside for the recycling. That's a relationship that TBI honors through the agreement they have to site their facility on Holt Road from a decade plus ago. Most of the complaints, although we've had a fair amount of complaints on both, the trash complaints were more pronounced about 2 years ago, I think, and we've seen some improvement. The recycling complaints seem to be specific to certain days where it appears as if the recycling vehicle, and this is somewhat anecdotal because we're not getting direct information back, it fills. The recycling truck then goes to the drop-off facility, which is in Peabody, and instead of returning back onto the route, it's near the end of the workday, and it returns back to the yard. We believe maybe to avoid overtime cost or whatever it is, they don't send the vehicle back out. So the vehicle then goes out the next day to finish the route that it didn't complete on the first day, causing the next day to be somewhat behind because by the end of that day, the same process sort of repeats itself. Primarily around Wednesdays and Thursdays from what I can see of the data, but there are certainly some other days as well. And so we've communicated that back to the vendor, that the expectation is you put the necessary equipment out there to pick up the material. Their travel to PVD is 30 minutes there and back. It shouldn't so alter the relationship we've had to alter the service expectation. But to date, we continue to have pretty regular problems, specifically on those days. That doesn't mean to the residents there aren't other days when we don't get other calls, but those seem to be the most obvious.
That finally makes sense as to why does it keep happening to the same
Yes.
neighborhood. The good news, bad news is, the good news is more people are recycling and recycling more stuff. The bad news is the trucks fill up.
Yeah, I don't think it's a volume question. I think it's, no, well, it's well, not a volume question in the sense that we're noting an additional load through the drop-off. It's just, I would think the services was traditionally provided with 2 vehicles, as it can commonly be. I believe there are times they're trying to service the entire load with 1 vehicle, which is going to cause the vehicle to fill. So a community of this size should have 2 vehicles out to cover an entire, every day's route is actually 2 routes. So every day's, if you list the street, we've now added some additional information on the website for residents. You can put in your street name. It tells you the day that you have trash and those kind of things. But on any, if you looked at our actual trash routes, we're in 2 different sections of the town in the same day. As a function of, there's a number of reasons why that is. But you really should service this community with 2 vehicles. Trying to do all of the recycling for 1/5 of the community's residences of a community of 30,000 with 1 vehicle, you're going to bump into the problem that your vehicle fills. And so there were times that there were 2 vehicles used, and we generally feel like, again, we're not getting necessarily direct answers to these questions, but we do believe there are times now that 1 vehicle is being used. And if you're going to reduce to 1 vehicle, then you should expect that you're going to be working earlier into the night because you're going to fill that truck, and it's going to cause you to go to the drop-off.
But this is what you think, but it's not necessarily been communicated to us. I mean,
Yeah,
in this conversation
sure.
is as if we don't do the recycling, it's this third party. And
Correct.
so even right now, we're kind of guessing where, I think we're at the point where we really need a hard answer.
Can I intervene 1 second to help out? This recycling is free because of the TBI, okay? Did we start having problems with recycling before we got rid of DeRosa?
I was going to ask about that.
I would say that if I went back and,
History lesson here, what's the...
yeah, okay, so we have, there's trash and recycling pickup and hauling. So there's one component. A vehicle goes out, goes curbside, picks up the material and puts it in a truck. Next, you must dispose of that material. In the case of trash, it's wheelabrator. So the vehicles go to wheelabrator, they dump the trash, okay? In the case of recycling, we have to bid where the recycling goes.
Yep.
It used to be DeRosa on Holt Road. DeRosa had significant, as we know, without chronicling those, DeRosa had significant issues and it had eventually gone out of business or defunct. So there needed to be an alternative place to deliver the recycling. We went out to bid on that. That now goes to JRM and Peabody. They provide us a subsidy. We're the only community in Essex County, we believe, who actually gets a subsidy for recycling. It does add, say, 30 minutes of travel, which if you add that together is an hour. Again, I would say 2 things. One is the convenience of having DeRosa here is an unusual luxury because most communities don't have a DeRosa and a wheelabrator. If you're next door or next door or next door, you don't have those facilities. Those are typically baked into the service expectations. If we had the good fortune of having both of those facilities here, then that was a good fortune to us as the recipient of service from Northside for trash, and a benefit to TBI for their relationship with Northside. But there's no guarantee of that in perpetuity. Every community, the vast majority of communities, pick up their trash and recycling in their own community and deliver that to an alternative community. Right. That's how it happens everywhere. We were actually the anomaly in a positive way. So I would say it wouldn't have been a problem if we're getting the proper amount of equipment on the road because what we benefited from back then was not something that necessarily would be an expectation moving forward. But I'm sure it's that. It should be noted, though, that we are now paying.
Export to
Correct. We're actually paying a cost, not intended by the contract. The contract basically says, again, the agreement to permit TBI said that they would pick up and haul recycling. But if that pickup and recycling were ever needed to be delivered outside of North Andover, we would pay the transportation costs. We're holding our end of the bargain. We're paying those transportation costs. But I assume there would have been an assumption if the agreement contemplated we'd have to pay for the travel, it certainly contemplated that the provider of the service, in this case TBI through Northside, would have had an expectation they would do what was necessary to make sure we get the service intended.
Also, for instance, I mean, I know that when, it seems like Tracy and I are on a similar text message thread with several different people who will email us when they're missed, and it seems to be Settlers Ridge, Hillside, Barker Street. By coincidence, it just so happened they missed completely my neighborhood tonight. But normally it's this other neighborhood. This is the first.
7 tomorrow morning.
So that's
Right,
actually, that's a good point that
Generally, like it's the
I,
same section of
Yes.
town.
but that's a good point that I'd like to ask though is, I'm not getting calls that they're missing the entire week and then people have to wait a full week before they come back.
Yeah.
They're coming back the next morning, which means is it as simple as tweaking our schedule so that the houses that are being missed are part of another
Yeah.
another route, so that way people
Or at
aren't.
least spread out the missing through town, so it's not. the
No missing,
same.
no missing.
Don't spread it out.
No, don't spread it out, that's worse.
No, because Monday
I
through
mean, very.
Actually, Laura, you may even be able to answer this. Monday through Friday, we don't get calls that people were missed the prior week, and so they have twice the load. They might have their trash or recycling. That's what we're talking about. Gets missed, and then it's picked up the next morning, anyways. Which means somehow in the 5-day pickup week, 6-day pickup week, they're able to get everything accomplished.
In most
Maybe
days.
it's just a matter of one day has too much. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I think
we
that,
approach them.
I think that's, we've had conversations with them, and again, if this were, I'm not putting all the responsibility on, but if this were a more traditional relationship, us with a vendor, we would be sitting down. I don't find that the communication is, because again, it's, for everybody, it's it's an unusual relationship. So we're not dealing with the vendor, we're dealing with the permit holder. The permit holder is dealing with the vendor. And although they are one and the same in some ways, there is also times that it's not quite as simple as that, right? And so, we've had conversations, and I think we've offered the opportunity to make things better, but we're not necessarily getting a straight answer about the number of pieces of equipment. Sometimes we see unlabeled rented equipment. We're not being told why that's the case.
Yes,
If a piece
yeah.
of equipment's down, we're not being told a piece of service is out, piece of equipment is out. Other vendors, quite frankly, sometimes, because I do generally think that Northside it's getting out of the business in some ways. I think that's a fair statement, that they don't have some of the redundant equipment. So on another haul, you may have a second piece. That piece goes out of service, you get a replacement piece. If you got a call from service at 3 in the afternoon that recycling wasn't picked up, you'd get a second piece of equipment that would show up and solve the problem. Then the vendor would be saying to you, hey, I don't want to commit this time and resources. What can you do to help me? We're communicating the problems. It'd be difficult for us to find the solutions, but in a traditional vendor relationship, the vendor would be coming to us with solutions because they financially benefit them to do that. So I believe we've communicated in an open way to the vendor, to, in this case, TBI, and we're open to looking at alternatives. I think in the end, it is incumbent upon the person we have the permit with, being TBI, to say, hey, if you did this, it would work better. I think we're open to those. Normally, in a traditional relationship, it would be the vendor, because of their bottom line, that would say, can you do this for us?
Because they're the middleman, what's then the next step to make sure it's clearly communicated to them and let them know that it just, for a big chunk of this, for a neighborhood, not a big chunk, but
Yeah.
a substantial neighborhood, I mean, this is really the only town service they access, and there's a lot of good things happening in town, but right now what they see is every
Well,
other week their
yeah.
recycling isn't getting picked up, and they're left with something to complain about that really, I mean, it's unfortunate. If we could tweak it, I mean, this has been happening my entire
Yeah.
time on the board.
You're going to be getting some calls pretty soon, them starting at 6:30.
Don, respectfully, I mean, we're getting calls and text messages and Facebook messages. It's relentless. We saw it blow up over
We
Leeds.
saw it before, I saw it tonight.
I don't see
And I
it.
got
I
a
don't
text
see it.
today.
What time did they start now? At 7, right? They have to start at 7?
They have to start
They're
at
pushing
7.
the envelope now, they're going earlier.
They can't start on, right?
Can we reach out to the vendor? I know you do. I know you talk to the vendor quite often.
Yep.
Can we reach out and again say, what do we have as a solution? What can we do?
Yeah.
And, I
course.
think splitting the route presents a problem because now you've got trash on one day and recycling on another day unless you can
I'm
keep
not-
those in alignment.
No, I wouldn't do
Talking
that.
about that-
No, I think
type of
that,
splitting.
well, I think we have the immediate problems, and we have sort of longer stand questions that we will eventually need to address. If we're going to move to an alternative provider, and the question will be, we may end up in a community where the recycling provider and the trash provider are two different vendors. I'm not sure that's going to help. It makes it more difficult, makes it more difficult for the residents to understand who they're talking about. It may, in some ways, make it clear where some problems lie, because in cases where you're jammed and you're throwing some recycling in a trash truck, that option is sort of gone. And just having two different pieces of equipment and two different vendors on a, I've never found that to be the best solution.
Anyways, because the trash truck comes, and then recycling or vice versa, I don't remember.
Yeah, it's just sort of the distinguishing, I guess from my point of view, the simple, in a perfect world, I understand there's all kinds of reasons for these things. It'd be better to be able to directly be dealing with the vendor delivering the service, and that's what doesn't exist today. But yes, I would never say, and I don't think Mr. Valencourt was suggesting that. What he was suggesting was, if we realign some routes, would realign both? You would never split it.
Right.
I think the question is, again, I think we've opened the channels enough for them to have suggested that, and they haven't. I would want a commitment that they're committing the right amount of equipment, that we're not just altering people's lives and changing their route to find out we just pushed the problem to Friday and Monday and not Tuesday to Wednesday. I don't want to just find out that we're moving the problems to other parts of town. I understand what you're saying, but I
Friday and Monday would be
prefer
very
not to be that problem. And then I would also want at the table the vendor who's likely going to take, we haven't made that decision yet, the trash contract, because they will be party beginning, August 1st for a 5 to 10 year contract on what those routes look like. And if their sort of view of the community is that the existing routes are the way to do it, then I don't know I would disadvantage them to someone else, or vice versa. So, one, we will open up lines of communication, see if we can facilitate that, but I don't think we change routes. I'm loath to change routes temporarily. Oh, we're going to send you all this paperwork, and we're going to change your route from Thursday to Friday, and then find out 6 weeks later, oh, by the way, we're going to go back.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that we're far enough along with the new vendor. I would love to encourage the existing TBI to engage whoever we select as a vendor to hire the same company, so we're dealing with one company. That would be my preference for everybody in the community, quite frankly, so it's one vendor delivering the service. Then at least if we get a complaint, because we have the leverage of the trash contract, it's a little easier to have leverage on the recycling contract, even though we're not the direct contact. So we'll continue to open up channels to find ways to do things. I think in the end, the relationship with TBI is in many ways a monetary agreement, right? It's we're agreeing to provide X for the benefit of having a permit. And TBI, as I guess it should, will make its decisions about who will be the vendor and what the service will be based upon the economics to TBI. And that's different than it would be if I had a vendor and I called the vendor and said, you're not completing your task, 30 days and you're gone. I don't have that ability with the recycling contract.
And that one hand tied behind our back is tough, but it doesn't change for those residents who are being impacted by
Absolutely.
service.
Yep.
That they're being impacted by the lack of service.
So what's our short-term solution?
Yeah, we continue to have a communication to find out if there's alternatives. But again, if the alternative is we want to change these 3 streets, I would want to make sure that we complete a process for an alternative vendor for a trash company and make sure there's agreement so that we don't start and then turn back. Or the trash company, the new trash company says, geez, your prior routes are what I'm giving you some, we started to obtain feedback from new companies. Mm-hmm. They know what our existing routes are. Maybe their communication with us was about these routes. So I don't want to automatically assume it's the routes, but it's something we should discuss. So the short term is reopen a communication with TBI about the service response of North Side. It has been unacceptable. I would argue to you, and I shouldn't say this publicly, I guess, it may not be unacceptable per the terms of the agreement, but it's unacceptable to us, right? Because deciding that you do not want to pay overtime to pick up the trash the recycling that was required in that day, because you know you can pick it up the next day, is not fair to the residents. And it's going to be that much worse if the trash is picked up on Wednesday and the recycling stays at curbside till Thursday, when we have a vendor who may pick up the trash on that day. So we'll continue to have the dialogue, and I wish I had a stronger answer for you, but part of it is the nature of the business relationship we have.
I think a large part of it.
Yeah.
Is it a reasonable expectation to say at our next meeting, we could get some type of update? Or would you
Of course.
prefer- Okay.
Yeah, of course. Yep, that's very reasonable. Yep. So I would suggest that whether it's trash or recycling or anything else we do in town, potholes, people are using the reported system, continue to do that. It provides us an opportunity across the board, whatever the relationship is, to have something in writing or a sort of a timestamp of issues that are occurring. I know sometimes it can be frustrating. You put in a comment or report it, and then you put it in the following week, and you put it in the following week. But for us, in all of our dealings with residents and with vendors, if we have that kind of record, it does help us have a conversation. We map all this stuff. I can tell you where the recycling is not picked up. I can tell you where the recycling and trash complaints are coming from. I can tell you where the potholes are. I can tell you where the dogs are. So it does help us get a general sense of, I think what we all know is that it seems to be specific to certain sections and towns and certain days.
Yeah.
Well, actually, you solved a mystery. We kept figuring out why somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I don't have a problem, but I'm at
Right.
the beginning of the week.
Me too.
And part of it is that tool, you can see the data, you can see where it always is, and then maybe
It's
that
always the
backs
same
into the
neighborhood.
solution. Yeah.
And it was like,
Yep.
this is crazy.
Except today.
It's all,
Except today.
Except today
We
was
all
an
get Monday pickup.
anomaly, yeah.
Yeah, I got this.
It's Wednesday and Thursday, but I'm guessing, I'm making a reasonable leap that the Thursday problem is actually created by a Wednesday problem. And it's correct. And I will stand by the fact that this is a two-route community, and if it were a traditional vendor contract, we would compel the vendor to have 2 trucks. And if this vendor is using 1 truck, it's just not possible to pick. We are a good recycling community. And if you're trying to cover an entire route with 1 vehicle,
Not gonna work.
it's
Not in a
just not
community
going to
like
work.
ours.
So I would say that we would be requiring that with a new trash hauler, and we would be requiring it with a new recycling hauler. And that way, you're not ever in that problem. I'd rather have the truck a little empty than using 1 truck, have it be full, and stop for the day and leave residents with their recycling outside. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll look for another update at our next meeting on 23rd. 23rd. Okay, thank you for that update. And, all right, next, we're going to jump back to item A, and we're going to welcome our legislative delegation, Bruce Tarr, Katie O'Connor-Ives, Jim Lyons, and Diana DiZoglio. Thank you very much for coming tonight. We always look forward to your visits, so it's great to have you here.
First off, I'd like to say congratulations to Katie with that new baby.
Oh,
How
yes,
old is our new baby
congratulations.
now?
9
You look
weeks.
fantastic.
So excuse the casual attire.
No,
Hey, you're here.
Oh, I know, but we
That
wanted
was-
to get through the meeting. Thank you, though. It's great.
yeah, thank you all for coming tonight, taking time from your very busy schedules to be here. And let me, secondly, after the congratulations, which is obviously the first thing we want to get out, just want to recognize some of the great work that you guys have helped us with in the past. Most recently, we celebrated the opening of not celebrated, but we recognized the opening of the crosswalk up in Merrimack College, which was something that, you guys all helped us with and got that implemented. We've had new signage on 495 and things that we've been looking for quite a while, so thank you very much. We have a great new Safe Routes to School, which I know you guys all helped us get that through. So, and I know I'm missing some, so you guys can jump in here, but, I think we've had a great working relationship over the last few years, and we love to see that, and obviously that's going to continue. So we appreciate you guys being here tonight and giving us an update from Capitol Hill, from Beacon Hill.
Capitol Hill would be good.
Yeah, Beacon Hill. Sorry, Beacon Hill. One of those hills.
They're busy.
Or maybe Wire Hill. I don't know, whatever you want to do. We've just been talking trash for the last half an hour, so we just keep it going. But thank you, and anybody else want to start off?
It's great to have you all here.
Oh, thank you. So, Who wants to go first, or how would we want to approach this?
Bruce is ready to start.
I was going to say, let's go with Bruce. Then you might not have to talk.
Thanks, Fred. All right, well, unaccustomed to public speaking as I am, I'll get us kicked off, but I know the delegation has a lot to say, and I just want to begin, Mr. Chairman, by responding in kind. We really appreciate the partnership and the dialogue that we have with all of you on a regular basis, and the things that you just took note of, I think, are really demonstrative evidence of the relationship that we have, and the fact that you are very efficient and effective at developing priorities for us to respond to. You identify them, you relate to us the nexus with state government and the ways that we can help, and we're very pleased to follow through and work with you on those things. And you've noted a number of them, including the signage, the crosswalk, which was something that we had talked about very early on at a meeting very similar to this one the last time that we gathered together. And also, I know that we want to talk a little bit about Berry Pond and some of the other things that we've been able to do together. So we do appreciate being able to be here and being able to hear your priorities, to tell you a little bit about what's happened. You're obviously aware of the vast majority of that, and also to tell you a little bit about what's to come. And so I do have a packet. I know that comes as no surprise to any of you, but just to give you a little bit of an update on what's happening on Beacon Hill right now, and then I'll defer to my colleagues to talk about some of the individual pieces. But we were sworn in last Wednesday, and we began the new legislative session. And a good deal of what's happening right now is a thought process around what bills will be filed for the next legislative session. And so January 20th will be the deadline for the filing of legislation. And you may recall from our past conversations that legislation that is filed in a timely way must have a public hearing. And so the first comment that we would have for you tonight is to think about things that you would like to have us file for consideration in the session. We obviously all work together as a team, as a legislative team, and so we'd be happy to consider the things that you may have for us. The next thing to think about is the fact that the budget is coming very quickly upon us for the coming fiscal year. And so the governor, and there's a piece in the packet about this, the governor will file, thank you, will file in the fourth Wednesday in January, and the budget this year will be a very challenging one. I think everybody's familiar with the constraints that we face, and one of the particularly challenging situations is that in an economy that has a very low unemployment rate, we actually are struggling to develop enough revenue to be able to respond to our spending priorities. So that misalignment is causing a lot of concern to be able to try to rectify that. And it seems like a significant issue is the amount of sales tax that isn't being collected as a result of sales on the internet. So we can talk more about that later, but that budget will be particularly challenging. As you all know, the House will debate the budget in April, the Senate will debate it in May, and the goal is to have a budget in place by the beginning of the new fiscal year in July. And again, I would suggest that we come to visit you somewhere in the April-May timeframe so we can give you a better update about what's likely to happen from a budgetary perspective. But it's important for you to know right now that that's the general timeframe for things to happen. Wanted to talk a little bit about the cherry sheet, and obviously you saw some improvement in fiscal year 17 over fiscal year 16. I would hazard an educated guess that you would like to see more, but we will continue to make local aid as a priority as a legislative delegation, as we have, and I think that the legislature as a whole, and our delegation in particular, has a good track record of advocating for local aid to be a priority, even in difficult fiscal times, and we'll continue to look forward to that. In addition to that, Chapter 70, I know, is always an issue. And again, we've seen some gains in Chapter 70, but that's something we need to continue to work on. And one issue that's been of concern in the last legislative session and will continue to be is the report that was done by the Special Commission on the Foundation budget. And you may recall that originally in 1993, when we passed the Education Reform Act, there was to be a review commission that would review periodically whether the foundation budget was meeting the needs of the cities and towns and local school districts all across the state. And clearly, there has been a disparity between what the foundation budget provides for and what you're having to do to educate students. And so we all fought very hard to get a review commission reestablished and done, and its recommendations are very interesting. Two of the most significant are that the foundation budget is inadequate with regard to special education and with regard to health insurance for teachers. Now, to rectify those two things would cost somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion. And so we've been struggling to find a way to make the necessary changes and support them with funding, and that will continue as well in the next legislative session. That being said, there is a page in the packet, again, I'll give it to you at the end, relative to our budget, and we continue to be year-to-date slightly below what our benchmark is, and the benchmark has been adjusted downward. And you know that the governor made $98 million in cuts to be able to stay within the budget. Year-to-date, currently we're about $38 million still below the benchmark, but December numbers were looking more positive. So we seem to be in a better trend, but again, we're still below benchmark. With that, it's also time to think about what kind of laws are going into effect. And just very quickly, the public records law went into effect on January 1st, the new one. I know that is of concern to a lot of folks. The minimum wage rose to $11 an hour. And we also saw on December 15th the effective portion of question 4 relative to marijuana, which dealt with possession and growing. And the remainder of the bill has been given a 6-month extension so that we can work out the details. That's something there's been some confusion about. The delay affects some portions of the bill, but not all of the portions of the bill. And then last but not least, I'll give you some of the things that I am thinking about in terms of legislative proposals. But that's a brief update on where we are right now on Beacon Hill, some of the concerns that we have and some of the things that we anticipate happening. And with that, I will actually stop and defer to my colleagues who have a lot to say about a lot of those subjects.
To follow up with what Senator Tarr was saying about the January 20th filing deadline for legislation, in addition to bills that we could file ourselves, if you see other legislation that you think we should co-sponsor and sign on to, that's important as well, because every time there's a legislative session and bills aren't successful, they're refiled by our colleagues, and many important topics are covered along those. And we also co-sponsor each other's, because North Andover has 4 legislators. That is that much stronger to have 4 people sign on to a bill. So we'll definitely be interested in doing that. In terms of legislation, I think some of the priorities we all share pertain to the area of opioid abuse. And in October, the initial bill that we did went into effect, which required 2 weeks for insurance to cover substance abuse treatment. But there's a very smart bill that didn't make it through in the last legislative session that will be focused on to extend that for 1 month of substance abuse treatment covered by insurance. And even the bill that we already passed has some kinks in it in terms of its application. Hospitals like Anna Jakes are struggling to make sure that the insurance companies are being responsive to the intent behind the law, so we'll continue to work on that as well. And another bill that passed the Senate, which I personally think is incumbent upon us to get across the finish line in the next session, is the hands-free cellular use bill, which New Hampshire has adopted. And I know we have personal anecdotes about how many close calls there are and how dangerous that is, and that seems like a common sense thing that the Massachusetts legislature should be able to get behind. Some other bills that pertain specifically to North Andover that we've always worked hard on as a delegation focus around the area of unfunded mandates. We're working closely with Auditor Bump. She's been a fantastic partner to try and ensure that there are more standards, and she has an actual office and staff with the local division of unfunded mandates. We want to utilize that staff and that talent to give our cities the tools that they need to figure out whether or not the bills that we pass and the regulations that agencies pass are actually unfunded. In terms of the various projects that we've all focused on, I know that we've made great stride when it comes to 114 and Merrimack College, and I think that public safety is at the forefront, but we also have to keep in mind that if we're going to really implement all the recommendations in the road safety audit, that's a multi-million-dollar investment, and we have to continue to figure out ways to make that progress successive and build on the momentum that we've had, because it's not just a North Andover challenge, it's a Merrimack Valley statewide issue, because that thoroughfare is used by so many different people. So we'll continue to focus on that as well. I think that it's important to recognize when it comes to things like Chapter 70 or Chapter 90, all these things have the potential where the needs are almost unlimited, and the funding is always going to have that ebb and pull of so many different competing interests. But there's also the issue of cost containment too, and I think that we're going to be exploring that when it comes to things like special ed. Because the costs are so extreme, we also have to consider the policies that either DESE is implementing or that there's a certain status quo that we're going to continue to throw money at without necessarily assessing whether or not it's being done appropriately. So we'll focus on that as well. The other thing that we all share is the commitment and investment to Berry Pond. Senator Tarr took the lead in the last legislative session, and we signed on to funding it to the tune of almost $87,000 to ensure proper staffing and to make sure that the public can access that in a safe way. And as you know, there were so many things, like Senator Tarr said, that got axed with the 9C cuts, but I think that it sets an important precedent. And what you can be heartened by is the fact that Commissioner Leo Roy is committed to properly funding Berry Pond, regardless of the changes that happen with each budget cycle. The last thing I'll point out, and then I'll pass the microphone to my colleagues, is the issue of the kindergarten expansion grants in North Andover. Because the grants weren't funded in the last budget, lost out on a little over $100,000. And I passionately believe that kindergarten grants are important because it's a way to ensure that people, parents that want to be able to maintain their jobs and stay with their careers, the math doesn't add up if kindergarten is too expensive. And this affected not just North Andover, but so many municipalities throughout the state. And the prospects don't necessarily look good because once something is funded at zero out of conference committee, it's hard to get it back up. But we want to note that it's important, and we have to figure out to ensure, before we even worry about pre-K, if we're not getting kindergarten right, we need to keep our eye on that as well. So in conclusion, I also want to emphasize, even though we present to you things we're focused on, our priorities and some accomplishments, tonight for me is also an opportunity to hear from you about what we should be focused on forward going. And like Senator Tarr said, we got our marching orders about the 495 signage and Merrimack College safety issues from a meeting like this. And I also remember at one of these meetings, I remember specifically Selectwoman Smedili being concerned about even allusion to the possibility of any train construction activity in North Andover and layover stops and things like that. And I take those concerns to heart. What I do want to let you know, representing Haverhill with their experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I'm in close communication with MassDOT. And there are train stops still being built despite budget constraints throughout the state. And I don't want the town of North Andover to miss any opportunities to get a commuter rail stop built in North Andover if it makes sense for the town. So I would love to explore further the idea of a study to be able to figure out what prospects there are to have a low-impact project, the cost, the time frame, so that we're fully equipped with the information we need so that we don't miss any opportunity to have a commuter rail stop right here in North Andover. With that, I'll pass the microphone to my representative colleagues.
There you go. Go ahead, Diana.
It was the holding
I know.
station where the engines were running and the
Yes.
fumes were
Leave that Bradford.
And in Bradford, there are unique topographical issues, and it was built way too close to a neighborhood, and that would never happen on my watch. So rest assured, but I do know that your concerns pertain to the layover stations and all the nuisances around it.
facilities, the GLSD. So we take real concern about a layover that would bring, and people in Methuen should be feeling the same way because it's just across the river. So I just want to make it clear that it's not the stop, it's what was proposed with the stop.
Right.
So,
Yep, I recognize
but
that.
thank you.
Of course.
That's an interesting proposal, though. I mean, to at least study it and see, not the layover portion, but what the impact would be if we put a station in North Andover and where that would make sense to go. And that's what you're thinking when you're suggesting that, where it would even go, not just focusing on one site, but a very narrow corridor where.
I think that MassDOT has a specific swath in mind in the Osgood Landing area. I think that the data needs to back that up because that's the thinking right now. But the thinking, without representing their own views, is where is a layover station going to go? And the question is, the situation in Bradford had a potential years ago to be relocated in New Hampshire. And, yep, and that can still happen. We can still, as a person that represents Bradford, we could still go in that direction. But I'm still very interested in not missing an opportunity for North Andover. So I think that if we summarily say New Hampshire is the way to go with the layover station, the door closes on MassDOT being as interested in a North Andover train stop. So I want to explore everything. And the Bradford situation, you know, that I see the paperwork, and when Senator Bador was in, it was an issue. Senator Jajuga, Senator Costello, that's how long they've been responding to a layover station that should have never been built. So I'm not saying that there's not a layover station component. I'm saying I'd be hard-pressed to believe if that's ever going to be done in that form again, because you can't build one that close to a neighborhood. It just can't happen.
As part of the double tracking project, which has been funded and is ongoing, North Andover will see, first of all, North Andover is the only community north of Boston that does not have a commuter rail station, period. It is a notable absence, quite frankly, for any number of reasons, not the least of which is economic development in the region. Some of the communities, many of the communities, several of the communities have more than one stop. We have none. With the double tracking project, you're going to see more trains, quite frankly, pass through the community, not less. And so as a community that already receives the collateral impact of trains,
Right.
and any pollution, whether that's noise or inconvenience or however you want to define pollution, we should want to be part of the study which understands the impact of the commuter rail through the region, because we are impacted. We're impacted because we don't get the benefit of economic development, and we absolutely get the adverse impact of any environmental issues because the trains pass through the community each and every day. And though the number of trains that are going to pass through when the double tracking project is done is going to increase by some percentage, whether that be double or not. So I think it just makes sense that it'd be like having a study of the commuter rail north of Boston and not being at the table. It just wouldn't make a lot of sense. So from my point of view, I think it's a great idea to do some kind of holistic study that looks at the impact in the entire region.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with the idea of the study. I do want to just point out as well, and I know that many of you were actually at this meeting last year. I believe it was when Secretary Ash came, representing the administration. Secretary Ash is the Secretary of Economic Development for the state of Massachusetts. And he came to North Andover and he had an opportunity to hear some of your priorities, some of our priorities. And when the issue of the train station was brought up, I know that as you know, as we've expressed to you, we've been very supportive of that idea and how we can be helpful regarding that. And what was suggested back to us is that, and back to the people that were able to attend that session, many of you were at, was that we don't go to the administration asking for financing with a mentality of if we build it, they will come. They did want to see more development happening along the 125 corridor before we suggested a train station proposal there. Whereas a lot of people during the meeting were suggesting if we get the train station, then we'll see a lot more economic development on the 125 corridor. And I think that arguments can be made on both sides. So that is one of the concerns and challenges that we will be facing if this discussion is going to move forward, is the opinion of the administration, making sure that we're working in coordination with them. I know that Town Manager Andrew Mailer has had a really great working relationship with Lieutenant Governor Polito and with Secretary Ash, as does our minority leader, with the administration as well. But definitely, if we could just keep that as a top priority, that we do need to make sure that we are keeping tabs on the opinion of the administration regarding what's the best way to proceed forward if we are going to plan to move forward, pending the results of a study. I thought that my colleagues in the Senate did a great job of speaking about the things that we're going to be doing moving forward in this legislative session, as well as some of the accomplishments that the delegation has had over the past couple of years. And while I would love to go over it, I think there's something to be said for the sake of not being redundant, because we are all working in the state legislature together, and the priorities that they laid out are my priorities as well. Regarding the Berry Pond issue, I know that was brought up a couple of times. I was disappointed that the funding did get slashed that the Senate had filed for this upcoming couple of years for Berry Pond to be able to continue to be open and to succeed the way we've seen it in the past couple of years. But we are optimistic that we are going to see more funding coming forward, because we did get that initial money a couple of years ago to reopen it in the first place. It wasn't open for several years. To restore the bathhouse, that was about $40,000 we got together as a team. And we also were able to clean out the pond itself and bring that site back to full restoration. So we have made tremendous progress, and we're really excited about that. It is unfortunate that the funding did get cut this year, but we're optimistic that we will be able to see some of that funding stream in the near future. Now, one thing that wasn't brought up that we all strongly support is funding for our seniors, for our elders in the community. And for anybody that's watching at home as well tonight, this is something that you might be interested in. Our senior center, your senior services here in town, councils on aging, all of the services that are provided to your elder population in the town of North Andover. The state does have something to do with that. We do provide a certain amount of funding based on the amount of elders that do live in the communities. And this year, the funding for the councils on aging across the state actually went up from $9 per senior to $10 per senior, which, in speaking with Irene O'Brien and the seniors, I have my office hours there once a month. I get to speak with them. They were very excited. That is going to help them tremendously to be able to provide more resources, more activities for the seniors, more trips, what have you. So we were very excited to see that pass, and this delegation did strongly support and advocate for that passage this past session in the budget. Moving forward, I just want to echo what Senator Ives said and what Senator Tarr said regarding the importance of our communicating. Some of you I speak with once a week. Others I don't really have the opportunity to connect with as much, but I do want you to know that I am available to talk at any time if there's anything that you want to discuss. My cell phone's on my website. I think you all have it, actually. And I try to get back same day if I can, if not, as soon as possible. But as much as I think and we think that we have our finger on the pulse of what's going on in the community, and we try to advocate for our communities that we represent to the rest of the legislators across the state and to the administration, you have your finger more so on the pulse of what's going on in your community. No one on this delegation actually lives in the town of North Andover, and obviously you do, so we want to make sure that we're in constant communication with you, even about the little things, potholes, whatever it is. Feel free to contact us, make sure that we're in communication, because we are here to help, and you know what's going on in your community more than anybody. So I'm here to hear from you tonight more than anything.
What can I add to this? First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to come before you folks tonight. Happy New Year. And Tracy, I wish you the best of luck if we don't get a chance to sit with you again. It's been great working with you as a member of the Board of Selectmen. I have a list of priorities that I'm not going to go into in detail because some of them don't impact the town of North Andover. But my first priority has consistently been to try to increase local aid and to work with my colleagues to make sure that, all of our communities in our district, North Andover being certainly one of them, receives the most local aid possible. I think that does two things, as we know. It provides funds so you can provide the services that most taxpayers have, which is police, fire, teaches. Everything at the local level is how government, most of our government is day-to-day done at the local level. And also, it helps to give downward pressure on the property taxes. And I think it's interesting to note that from 2007 to 2015, state spending went up by 50%. However, local aid, not Chapter 70, but local aid actually decreased by 23%. And I think as a legislature, we have to really come to grips with what we're going to do going forward. And one of my priorities is to make sure that how we spend our tax dollars is accounted for. And one of the things that I've been hopping on since I was in the legislature is that we don't really have a solid grasp on where a lot of our tax dollars go. For example, we currently spend $1.8 billion on folks, some of them that we don't really have any grasp of, what their background is, whether they're even residents of the Commonwealth. And I think if we continue to see this kind of growth, it's incumbent upon us as a legislature to make sure we really have a grasp of where that money's going. And one of the things that many of us are working on is to put in place, the kind of restraints that the policymakers who are actually giving out the money in Beacon Hill know where it's going. And I think if we get a better handle on that, I think this will begin to help us be able to give more money back to our cities and towns. The other thing is that everyone brought up is the marijuana bill and the opiates. I am really, really concerned about this marijuana bill. I have the luxury of saying that my entire district voted against it. Everybody that I represent voted actually against the marijuana bill. I am against the marijuana bill, and I am, as all of my colleagues are deeply concerned about the implementation and the impact that this is going to have. And I'd like to hear, I see some of the cities and towns are out there trying to opt out of the bill and opt out of allowing shops into their communities. And I would love to hear what the members of the Board of Selectmen have to say. I, for one, would like to see it so it doesn't come into any of our communities. I intend to file legislation to aggressively try to limit what takes place. I was very glad to see that the legislature basically derailed it for 6 more months. And one of the things that I'm going to ask that we do is to all my colleagues in the House and the Senate is that at the same time we actually let that bill go forward, that we also allow the income tax rollback that was passed in 2000 go forward at the same time. So the fact is, we shouldn't be in any rush to let this bill go forward. We should make sure if we're going to allow this stuff to take place, that we get input from everyone. And remember that everyone knows the impact of what drugs is doing to our community now. So I hear people say, well, you don't go from marijuana to this heroin. Well, that's baloney. That is absolute garbage. Every one of us probably knows somebody who went from marijuana to Percocets to heroin. And this is the wrong time for us as a state to be putting this in place. The people of Massachusetts voted 53 to 47 for this bill. The people of Massachusetts in the year 2000 voted 56 to 44 to roll back the income tax. And we still haven't got there. So I hope we have the same discretion going forward with the marijuana legislation as if we had with, rolling back the income taxes. Certainly.
I appreciate that you did take something of a pause on this, but the thing is that is so confusing to me. I mean, there's several. I mean, Colorado is not really going well, so I think the pause was definitely necessary. But we spend, and I'm making this number up, probably billions of dollars on anti-smoking campaigns. We have CVS, we have other places that don't sell tobacco products, yet we as a state are now going to open this up. I don't get it. It doesn't add up, doesn't jive. And what they are finding, through some of the studies, is that the dealers, and this isn't, this has pros and cons and it goes back and forth, they're not making their money on selling marijuana in states that are it's legalized. So what are they doing? They're selling the cheap stuff, meaning heroin. We all know how inexpensive it is for heroin. So there's a lot that needs to be studied, really, and I'm grateful that you're taking pause, because once you do it, you probably can't go back.
I agree. One of the other, completely agree, and I know most of my colleagues are completely, we understand that the law was passed, but we also understand the consequences, and I think every one of us is going to make sure that we reach out to our communities. One of the other priorities of mine is to provide access and treatment and recovery for persons dependent upon drugs, and at the same time support police enforcement of laws that put these people who are selling this poison, put them in jail. I know we're all talking, there's prison reform and all kinds of mandatory sentencing reform coming before the legislature. But one of the last things we ought to be doing is giving these people who are selling fentanyl to our community any kind of leeway. When you know that you're taking something that is killing people, you ought to be put in jail, period. I saw the other day the police, that arrest that they just took place in Methuen, and the judge held them on $2 million. I was very happy to see that. So that's another area. He pled? Wow.
Pled guilty.
Well, I didn't hear that. Anyhow, that's another area that I'd like to hear your input on, because recovery works, treatment centers work. We as a legislature spent a lot of time in the last several years under the leadership of Governor Baker to put in place a bill and also provide it with funding. And I think another area that we really have to look at is giving our local cities and towns, particularly where we know that there's a real problem, giving them the dollars to go after these drug dealers. I met with the mayor last year, the mayor of Lawrence, and the police chief of Lawrence to discuss this very issue. We filed legislation, we got some additional funds, but I think we need more money. I think the public safety area, if we've got an epidemic, and we've got 33,000, as many people died last year in this country, as people that, 13,000 died from a gunshot wound, 33,000 died from an overdose. More people than died in automobile accidents. If we have an epidemic, I think we have to take a look at really funding these communities. It's very difficult for a local police force, if they're overrun by drug dealers, to be able to take care of their own community and then take care of the drug dealers. So I'm going to hopefully continue to work with Secretary Bennett and to hopefully provide additional resources to our police. So other than that, I think I agree with just about everything my colleagues had to say. So.
Board is going to disagree with you on any of those comments with
No,
respect to opioids.
except
With respect to opioids.
I would say that I don't necessarily know that marijuana brings you to heroin more so than Big Pharma brings you
I
to
completely agree
heroin.
with
I
you.
agree with that.
So,
Completely agree with that.
Yeah, good point.
No.
Which is,
I mean,
I
you
mean,
know,
the reason I brought it up is because I've heard so many people who are promoting the marijuana side saying that it doesn't lead to anything else. And my point was to say it does. Maybe it's not to the level that people think it is, but this marijuana that they're selling today is a lot different than the marijuana of 40 years ago.
I'm a simple girl. I say roll back the tax. Give the people what they want to
Yeah.
a degree. I don't agree as enthusiastically about one leading to the other
Yes.
as that. I think the problem lies the epidemic originated more with Big Pharma.
I agree with that.
Doctors' prescriptions, the over-prescribing of oxycodone and
Right.
oxycodone, and for minor injuries that should have been, and I think that's where the explosion began,
I agree.
more than someone smoking a joint over here. I'm not saying one doesn't correlate to the other, but I just don't connect the dots that easily, but I do. it's funny because when it comes to how you say, how you said that there was a much smaller gap when it came to marijuana being passed and the income tax rollback being passed 16 years ago. I mean, I always wish there was a way local communities, I've become such a smaller government person over the years, but, if local communities could govern themselves in that regard a little bit better, but that's not the system at the moment, but.
Trace, just following up on that, I guess the point that I'm trying to drive home is we're all aware of an epidemic.
For sure.
We should probably try to spend our effort and resources getting that under control, recognizing that the public has passed this law.
Agree.
Let's not rush. Let's try to solve one problem and get that under control.
Agree, but I would also suggest that while I agree with stronger imprisonment and going after the drug dealers and giving our law enforcement the tools that they need to go after to combat the crime aspect of it. I think one of the things that has to be recognized, that's very, very important to be recognized, there simply is not enough beds.
Yeah.
We need to build more beds. We need to help the folks that have been caught up in this epidemic, for however they got caught up in it. We're not rehabilitating them. We're not giving them anywhere to go. Ask anyone whose family has been affected by this epidemic, and they will tell you much of it lies in the realm of mental illness, too, because those with mental illness often self-medicate. It goes back to not enough beds, not enough facilities. I could go on and on and on what I think about what happened in the 80s and the pushing out and the closing. I think we could do it better, but that is something that I think is so important that you have to recognize as well. The tools are don't only lie with law enforcement, the tools lie within the medical community too.
No, and I agree. I think the other point, though, is that one of the things that as a legislature we focused on in the last 2 years was what you just mentioned, the education side, the treatment side, the bed side. And I think we should continue to focus on that and address what we do need for treatment facilities. But at the same time, it seems to me that
we have to. I'm with you on that too. I'm definitely with you on that. And I mean, in the old days we had DARE, and I know DARE is still out there. It doesn't. My son's 13 in 8th grade. He's never been through a DARE program, so I don't know how active it is anymore, but that was pretty effective for some generations, right after me, let's say. And so, yes, the money to educate and the money the tragic things we see with parents and children, and it's just, but recognizing it and all of the efforts. I mean, I applaud all of the efforts, because we're all in it together.
Right.
We're all in it together.
But touching, okay,
Sorry.
but again, reinforcing what Selectman Watson was saying about the medical community. Now, many of us in this room have to take courses as part of our different licenses that we might own. Does the medical community have to take courses perhaps in order to continue with their medical license on prescribing opioids? We have to take the...
No, I would assume.
Well, I mean,
They just passed that in the state legislature this past
see,
session.
we all think alike.
It's an opioid bill. And I can actually, because it's very intense, the piece of legislation, it's very inclusive. So what we can do is we can send you over a copy of that legislation with a summary if you want to go point by point. Just for the sake of, I know there's probably a lot of topics that you also want to talk to us about, so you can go through that. But that was, Selectman Daly, that was actually a part where doctors do have to get trained if they're going to be prescribing these dangerous substances. They have to kind of have like a little specialty in it now. There's also a statewide prescription monitoring program to help prevent people from doctor shopping. As anyone who has a friend who suffers from opioid addiction knows, if they can't get their substance from one doctor, they're going to go and try to find another doctor to get it from. So there's now an online database where every time a person's prescribed an opioid, whatever that prescription is, that is logged into the system, and then any doctor in the state that goes to prescribe them again will be able to access that database. And we're looking forward in the upcoming session on getting the results back from that program so we can continue to make improvements. But it still is in its initial phases, and we're still talking to different doctors not only in the North Andover community, but across the state as well. And they've been saying that it's actually had a tremendous impact, and they find it to be very helpful so far. So we do look forward to hearing more on that. Regarding the issue, Selectman Watson, that you brought up on the funding and the need for more beds, every single person in this delegation has fought tremendously
nail, I know.
to get extra funding for beds. And to us, substance abuse is about three things. It's about education and prevention, it's about treatment, and then it's about reducing the rate of recidivism, preventing people from relapsing and going back in once they have entered into recovery. The issue has been, in recent years, that we've actually increased funding by over 60% since I have entered the legislature back in 2013. So roughly, more or less, about 60%. We've been focusing a lot on treatment and recovery and trying to get those beds, and we have seen that increase. We've also started to focus now where the issue has been, because we've been adding so many beds, Selectmen, and we've been funding this so much more than we've been funding it in the past, that 60% difference. What we're seeing is, you want to see, when you fund things in that way, what you want to see is you want to see two parallel lines. If you're looking at a graph, here's the amount that we're funding, and it just keeps going up. What you want to see is another parallel line. What you want to see, excuse me, is an inverse line. If the funding's going up, you want to see substance abuse going down. And we haven't been seeing that.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why the legislature actually in the previous session, and it's continuing to do so, is focusing on education and prevention as the top priority regarding substance abuse. Because if we prevent people from taking that initial pill, getting that initial prescription and being unaware of the potential consequences of taking that prescription, then we will hopefully see the treatment, the need for treatment go down, because we do keep increasing beds, and there's still not enough. It never seems to be enough. Every year we increase beds, and every year we fund substance abuse treatment and recovery more and more and more by the thousands of dollars. And every year, in staggering numbers, we continue to see heroin overdoses and opioid addiction continue to rise. So this legislative session, I am going to be refiling, along with Senator Rives, a bill that we all support, which will increase education and which will require the Department of Education and Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, these acronyms get me sometimes, there's many of them, but it will require DESE to come up with a substance abuse prevention and education prevention and education program to implement in our public schools across the state. Now, as you mentioned, we had the DARE program years ago. The DARE program, I think, was a great program. I remember having it in school. I remember the police officers coming in. I remember, McGruff, we had the dog. And, I really remember that, and it really impacted me. The issue is that according to statistics, it wasn't having the impact that they thought it was going to have, and it
I'm
didn't.
using that as an example, Diane.
Well,
It's like
I love the DARE program. I love the DARE program.
Education, beds, recognize that much of opioid addiction has to do with mental health.
Exactly.
We leave a lot of the folks who suffer from mental health issues.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So
and I'm
it's
actually agreeing
kind of
with what you said about that. The DARE program, I think, was great.
It was great, but I know what you mean.
And I wasn't
updated.
in when they took it out of the school system. I wasn't in the legislature during that time. I was a little bit younger, not old enough to be elected yet. But when they did take it out, because I actually asked the same question, Selectwoman.
Yeah.
I actually, when I was studying this issue last year, we were passing our comprehensive opioid bill. I asked my colleagues, and I researched this and found out, because I said, why don't we have this anymore? And the reason was that they didn't have, it wasn't an evidence-based program is what they were finding.
Well, you modernize the program is the point.
Exactly. And when they took it out, they were supposed to modernize it, improve it, and they were supposed
Bring
to
it back.
come up with an evidence-based substance abuse prevention and education program and re-implement that into our public school system. And that, to date, has still not been done. So that's a top priority of this delegation and of the state legislature over the upcoming session.
That's great.
In I guess this is a very important topic. I hate to cut it off, but I think, we have a fuller agenda too. But I'd like to open it up to the board if there are other comments that they would like to make to the delegation for the coming year and the current session on what they would do. I guess I would make a comment about Berry Pond. I know it's kind of a very different topic, but given that there was an investment made in that pond last year and the facilities were brought up to a usable standard again, I would hate to see that shut down for another year, because that just means it's going to have to be updated again. So I think it's important that we look at that. And I don't know what the usage statistics were last year or not, if there was a considerable amount of usage there. I know I went out at the end of the season, but I didn't know how that was used. But I think it's important that we look into how we can keep that going, because we don't want to have to go back and redo all those facilities again.
So there seems to be very strong response in terms of usage to Berry Pond, and as Senator O'Connor Ives mentioned just a bit earlier, we are in continuing dialogue with Secretary Roy, or Commissioner Roy rather, about keeping the facility open, and we're trying to find ways to work through keeping it open even in the absence of a special earmark, because it should be part of the regular program of DCR. It shouldn't rely on extraordinary funding, because it is so important, and it should be incorporated into their budget. And so we continue to work on that so that we don't have these interruptions and that funding isn't sporadic, so that it becomes a regular part of their budget. So we appreciate the point, and we continue to try to drive that home to make sure that there's consistency in the availability of the resource.
87,000, that just seems like such a small amount of money. When there are problems with Berry Pond, meaning drownings and other issues, that falls on the town of North Andover. So there's clearly a need and a desire for it, but it seems like $87,000 for a quality of life issue doesn't seem like a lot of money.
I rounded up, it was 84,500.
Even better.
Yeah.
And again, when there are problems there where our fire and police have to go out to save somebody's life, or, it does fall on us.
So I think a couple of important points are relevant here, though. One is that that amount of money was an enhancement to what DCR had already programmed to be able to keep the facility open. Number two, a group that deserves a tremendous amount of credit are the Friends Group, who have also been raising money in addition to what we've been able to garner from the state. So it's a multifaceted funding picture right now. Our goal is to make sure that it doesn't rely on extraordinary measures every season to be able to keep the facility open. And the point about making sure that the investments that we've made are protected and strengthened is one that's very well taken.
And to underscore how interested Commissioner Roy is in Berry Pond, he wanted to be able to help the Friends make their fundraising more robust by doing some technical assistance to them, because there are these Friends groups throughout the state with all of the DCR properties. So not that we should pivot and then rely only on them for supplementing the budget gaps, but that's to point out that he really is focused on making sure that it's open and the water quality is good and that there's proper staffing.
Really more of a comment on the sales tax being down, and now there's an interest in taxing, online sales. But did you attribute that? Is that just an assumption, or did you look at the fact that perhaps the people still are not feeling good enough about the economy to be spending like they have in the past? Is it, or maybe it's a combination? I don't know. But when you first said it, I thought, yeah, but I think spending overall is probably down because people just aren't feeling good about, their family state of affairs or health insurance costs. I mean, we can go down the whole list. You know them all. We don't need to do that. But I just thought it was something worth looking at.
It is worth looking at, Rosemary, and especially since last spring, when we started to get some budget numbers that were not what we expected, particularly in terms of April revenue collections. Not only did Massachusetts, but states around the country began to try to look at what was happening, again, because we had relatively low unemployment rates that were dropping, and much of the state budget is actually driven by the income tax. So folks began to start asking questions about why this was happening. And certainly, and we saw this over the months that are particularly good for retail, like those leading up to Christmas. But we also started to look at other factors, and one of the other factors appears to be that folks may have earned more money, and they may be employed, but number one, they may be underemployed. but number two, they may have less disposable income, even though they have more gross income. So the cost of utilities and health insurance and other things may be going up and consuming what would otherwise be disposable income that would be injected into the economy through retail sales. So it's a very complicated picture, and we are trying to look at all of the pieces of it. And certainly, one that comes up a lot is the taxation of internet sales, which I'm sure the board is aware cannot be done on a state-by-state basis unless the federal government chooses to sanction it, because if it does not, and one state tries to do it individually, it becomes a violation of the Commerce Clause because one state is affecting interstate commerce versus the other states. So there is an anticipation that the federal government may move in that direction. If it does, the legislature has taken some preliminary steps to allow Massachusetts to participate in that form of taxation. I won't get into the merits of that tonight in terms of whether it's good or bad, but the state has taken some of those steps. So right now, we're trying to look at all of the pieces of the revenue picture to understand why we've seen the numbers that we have, which have left us, as we've talked about this evening, significantly below benchmark in some cases, though we are starting to close that gap a little bit.
Just to follow up on the sales tax issue, I think another theory that I haven't heard discussed too much at the state level is that in 2009, that's when we actually raised the sales tax by 25%. So you would think that the revenue in 2010 should have gone up by 25%, but it didn't. It only went up by 19.8%. So at the beginning, the whole theory was, let's increase the sales tax, which will lead to, increased revenues. And I think one of the things we could be seeing is the exact opposite taking place, that increasing taxation, at the beginning might seem like a good idea, but long-term, particularly at all the border states, it could still be having a negative impact. So that's something that I think we have to look at, is how do we tax going forward? Are these increased rates really leading to the economic dollars that we thought they were going to have? I suggest to you that they're not.
So I appreciate the philosophical split on tax increases, and I know that Representative DeZoglio and I had several conversations about this issue, because I was trying to think of I was excited to have the delegation here. This is the first time that I've had a chance to speak with all four of you. And I was trying to think of ways that you could help North Andover without having to just leave here thinking, okay, I have to increase local aid and just upping that number, because even still, as Senator Tarr said, that doesn't necessarily translate into a whole bunch more money for North Andover because of the funding formula. One thing that we do participate in that is outside of the tax system right now is the Community Preservation Act. And so I know that right now we tax locally up to 3%. We get a match from the state. That match fluctuates. And there was one piece of legislation that was, I think, unsuccessful last session that Senator Ives co-sponsored, but it had about half the legislature as co-sponsors, bipartisan support, to require that a minimum of 50% be matched. So on the local level, right now I think, Andrew, you'd have to correct me, we got around 20%, 25% matching funds last year. The legislation that the senator put forward was, or Senator Cream put forward, but Senator Ives supports, would require that be upped to a minimum of 50%. It's not funded through taxes, although the legislature commits millions of dollars each budget cycle of taxpayer dollars to fund that match. It would be through mortgage transactions or real estate transaction fees. Is that something that could absolutely benefit North Andover? It would absolutely make a difference this session, because I think 11 more communities joined the CPA this past fall. So it's a limited pie that we keep cutting and cutting and cutting. So you can keep backfilling it with tax dollars or free up those tax dollars for other causes and create a mechanism to fund that so that we get 50%. So you end up actually indirectly sending us more money, more local aid. We now have, Selectman Watson is leaving us for the greener pastures, hopefully literally greener pastures of the CPC. But that would be a way that, we've certainly, I think we have truly countless examples of where we've benefited as a municipality. And certainly that's, we've shown that we're willing to put local tax dollars behind it. And so that would be helpful if you could support the senator's efforts. And as I said, it appears that it was bipartisan, the support that it received of the 80-plus members on the House and Senate side. So just throwing that out there as a little outside-of-the-box suggestion, because local aid isn't just Chapter 70 and unrestricted. It's so much more. I don't want to circle back to the opioid and have that can of worms open. I know that especially both representatives have been very patient with me and meeting with me. Representative Lyons met with me in the middle of Christmas season at his tree farm. But one thing that would be helpful is a lot of municipalities right now are looking at putting funding behind actual positions and almost recreating the wheel in each of the 351 cities and towns, because residents don't necessarily know where to go. And so we've talked at length about this, Representative DeZoglia, of how a lot of people come to Methuen where they have 2 full-time staffers, and a lot of people are actually from New Hampshire, in fact, just because there are right now so few professionals out there. So trying to centralize that into some regional approach so that parents, especially, because I feel like it's parents that seem to not know where to go. We've had some great nonprofits kind of fill that gap of being a resource, but if there's some type of consistent way that we can have residents.
Can I follow up on that and just ask a question to the Board of Selectmen for anyone who wants to answer the question? We do, as Selectman DiCollegiero brought up, have 2 staff people working with the Methuen Police Department whose job is to basically make sure that they're taking care of anybody that comes in that has a substance abuse issue, that has a family member who has a substance abuse issue, and to make sure that that person and their family are provided with guidance, with direction, and with the resources that they need to be able to find the treatment, educational opportunities, or beds. I have people calling my office many times looking for beds, looking for homes for their son or daughter or nephew, whoever it is, who needs a bed, who needs a treatment facility to enter. And it can be very taxing on a family when they're not only dealing with somebody overdosing, but getting them into a treatment and recovery center, to have to get on the phone after the overdose and to try to look for something, not knowing what's available out there and not being an expert in that field. That's something that those 2 Methuen staffers provide to the Methuen community. We do see people coming from outside of the Methuen community as well, and taking advantage of that resource. I think it is a great idea to see if it's an option to pool some of those resources. North Andover, Methuen, right next door. I represent both communities. And I know for a fact that both police chiefs work very well together as well, and they do share information regarding substance abuse issues and overdose rates in the towns and ways to address the crisis. But my question to the Board of Selectmen is that something that you would be interested in, as far as having a person working in that capacity for the town of North Andover, for the police department, or in your public health department? That would be somebody on staff providing those resources. Has this been something that's been discussed?
So 2 things. One is, we had a meeting with Chief Solomon and the staff some time ago, directors of the Board of Health, the 2 chiefs, others, fire department, fire chiefs. It was enlightening, quite frankly. We're fortunate, not that the problem has avoided us, but quite frankly, in comparison to some of our neighbors, has spared us to a certain degree compared to the magnitude. The magnitude is almost tenfold difference in Methuen and Haverhill relative to what we're finding as statistics. What we agreed to coming out of that meeting was to develop our own statistics, which we do report to the Board of Selectmen on a monthly basis about the number of responses to opioid overdoses, the number of deaths, and we've broadened that to include other overdoses of various kinds. We're tracking it as it relates to residency and non-residency. I think for us, and I will speak for me as the person who produced budget, not from a policy perspective, Selectmen may feel differently, it's the value, weigh, and response. And we haven't, we've been fortunate that the overall impact on our community is not to the degree of some of those. Doesn't mean it's spared us or it doesn't exist. I don't want to, sort of put a cover over it, but to the degree of committing staff, I think the reaction of my advice to the board at the time was, let's see if the problem grows, and that we'd always be interested in a regional solution, but adding staff when there's a question about whether or not people would know how to use the staff, and the extent of the problem would be difficult for us as a first step. I remember talking to Chief Solomon, and he said we hired the staff, and it actually took him quite a period of time before residents knew who to call. And these staff members who had great resources and great background weren't quite sure of their role because it hadn't quite sort of sunk in yet. So I think the question for me, and the board may have a different answer, and I respect that, is that we have to see how the problem travels for us. And for us, the number of overdoses and the sort of makeup of the overdose individuals has been largely static over the last 3 years, and we don't get as many calls. But we certainly have talked to the Board of Health Director and indicated that he may be the person that people reach out to. And if what we're getting as a response through that office grows to the magnitude of needing a full-time person, which for us is, pretty significant commitment, then we certainly would be open to do that. But it hasn't seemed to change since the dialogue first came up here.
The benefit of the state doing it is that it's a form of local aid, right, rather than kicking, and not that you're kicking it, but rather than it be on the shoulders of local taxpayers. It's economies of scale. I mean, as the town manager said, some of our neighbors are dealing with it in a lot. It's having a far greater impact across far more of that community, or the communities around us, necessarily than us. I mean, but Andover and Methuen both have taken very different routes with hiring local individuals. I mean, it would be great if there could be some type of consistent statewide approach, so that way, I mean, the only time I've ever been asked about it was from somebody indirectly who was connected to Haverhill. And so, I mean, even if North Andover had something, I wouldn't have known. And I mean, we all know people in other communities. I mean, that's why all of you are here. So rather than have this patchwork approach, it would be great if there could be that consistency. And the benefit is it ends up helping us in that local line item, right?
I would say
Saves us
to
money.
add to Selectman DiCarlo, pointing to something you raised, Diana, if as a function of the legislation, which would add to the DESC's requirement as to be a fundamental sort of component to education system, to me, that's where regional education could be really helpful as a first step. There's no reason why. I think what gets difficult is that we're so damn parochial, right? Mm-hmm. So we struggle with regionalizing health departments. We struggle with regionalizing all kinds of things. It would seem like a human resource ad to address a regional problem, a problem truly with no borders, would have to be a component piece of something else we regionalize, like boards of health, and we don't do those really well, right? But as a function of education, if we're creating a sort of single curriculum for this kind of problem, it would seem like there could be an accepted curriculum that was taught regionally in some fashion, or available regionally in some fashion. So it makes the bill, in some ways, maybe easier to tow through the legislature because it's not viewed as an unfunded mandate and not viewed as a different variable for each district to have to interpret. So some kind of standard curriculum that could be implemented regionally may be a way to sort of combine both of the discussions.
It would seem to me that one point we could all agree on is there should be more comprehensive portal to access services. And how we best structure that is a question for discussion, but one advantage of having DPH do it is the agency would have the ability to have regional individuals or centers where people could access those services. So perhaps it does make more sense, and we should talk, and we will talk with the folks at DPH about the possibilities for that, so that perhaps we could divide the state into regions. We do have public health regions. That might make sense, or maybe there's some other regional basis that we could use to try to facilitate that. One program that's been of a lot of interest in my hometown in Gloucester is the Angel program, which I think folks are familiar with, where the chief essentially said to the police department that if you present and you ask for treatment, we will give you referral to treatment. The difficulty with that program has been finding enough beds, as we've already discussed, but the interesting thing is folks have been using the program, have been being referred to treatment, and they have avoided prosecution for simple possession. And just to revisit this for a moment, it seems to me that the dividing line ought to be that we need treatment for folks with addiction and we need punishment for folks who are causing the addiction. And if we follow that guideline, I think we can make progress on both fronts. But Selectman, I don't want to miss your point about the CPA. And it is important that we try to respond, and the problem is growing for two reasons. Number one, as more communities get added, the amount of money that we have gets divided among more communities. And number two, because we have had, up until more recently, a depressed real estate market, and that's changing now, but the tax that we were collecting was not as robust because people weren't filing as many documents. So hopefully, the second part of that will change. It's a good thing that more communities are adopting the CPA for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that it enables a coalition to form to advocate for CPA funding. It hasn't happened in the last couple of years, but there was a time when we would have to fend off threats to the pool of money to begin with, because someone would say, well, not every community benefits from this funding, so let's put it into the general fund or some other place where every community can get a piece of it. I think that time has passed and we've turned that corner, but having communities aligned around the idea of CPA funding is important. And if we did the 50% match, the issue would still be finding the funding. So it's important to understand what we have done in the last couple of budgets, and this delegation has been very supportive of it, and that is to say that if there is a surplus at the end of a fiscal year, and some may say, well, how can there be a surplus when we're making cuts? But very oftentimes, when we close the books on a particular fiscal year, there are funds left over for various reasons. And what we've said is, let's take a portion of that surplus and put it into the CPA. And it's been one of only 2 or 3 things that legislation has passed to fund in that way. One is the life sciences, because it's an economic driver for the state, and the other has traditionally, over the last couple of years, been the CPA, to say, let's take a portion of the surplus and put it into that. So we have taken steps to identify a funding source to put money back into the CPA. I suspect we'll be advocating for that again, but your point is very well taken, that if we expect a strong partnership around the CPA, then the state needs to hold up its end of its commitment and its end of the funding. So we understand that. We've been trying to take those interim steps to identify some funding that might be available, and we know that we need to continue to look at it for the future.
So it says right here, so part of the mechanism of this law, of this bill, would be that it would be adjusting the real estate fees. So that's the appeal right there, is it's not a tax, it's real estate fees. And unless this is wrong, the Community Preservation Coalition said that those fees haven't been adjusted since Paul Salucci was governor anyways. So given the economy and the 20-year that have passed, I mean, I would think it would be worthwhile. And it seems, like I said, with the broad bipartisan support, it's something that may be actually attainable. And again, the benefit is direct to a community like North Andover. Right. So, and even though not every community benefits from the CPC, I mean, part of that relationship with the state is that we provide for a surcharge, in North Andover's case, 3%. Sure. And that's why we would ask. I don't want to speak for everyone, but that's a way where we're not talking about tax increases. It's a fee increase that's very specific to the real estate market. So.
The other thing that I would ask you to focus on in terms of your advocacy, we've talked a lot about revenue going up and down and the needs that are just staggering, but there is the issue of tax credits that are given to different entities, whether it's the film tax credit or different corporate tax credits that range into the millions and millions and millions of dollars, and that's money that the state loses, and then services are reduced or infrastructure is left unaddressed. So I think that there's always a lot of talk every legislative session about sunsetting certain tax credits or doing a comprehensive study and figuring out which ones are value added, which ones have a public benefit, and which ones don't. But the number of dollars that the state doesn't collect because of the supposed benefit of those tax credits is monumental, and I think that it's every bit as important as the very controversial debates on how we generate revenue.
Well, I wish I had a pointed direction or bill I could reference, but I struggle with the fact that we have many initiatives, not the least of which is 40B, to address the concept of affordable housing. I just struggle with why very few, if any of them, are addressing the issue of affordable housing for seniors. And not like any other community, we're seeing a growing senior population. Mm-hmm. We continue to talk with people who just can't afford their homes anymore. They don't have an affordable solution. We certainly have experienced comprehensive permits here in affordable housing, with no disrespect to whoever is serviced by the affordable housing. But generally speaking, we're not providing an opportunity for our residents to be here 2 generations, to stay in the community and give back. And we find more and more of them struggle. So whether that's tax abatement programs or whether that's alterations to 40B to encourage density bonuses where it's not being encouraged, we are regularly visited by folks interested in building fairly mid-sized to fairly large residential developments in the community. And that's okay. That's part of the sort of process, right? We're never approached by someone looking to build 150 or 250 or 200 units or 100 units of market rate or maybe slightly below market rate housing for seniors. You talk to a developer and you talk to over 55 housing, and they say, it just doesn't work. It's not appealing. Yeah, we bump into seniors who are buying, whatever they can for condominiums or the rentals.
Well, the 55 and older, I think, don't work because generally it's out of the reach of the average 65-year-old or 70-year-old
Yeah.
or those who are retired. I'm only jumping in
No,
because
no, I
obviously if
appreciate
it's affordable housing, I'm jumping in on it.
But I'll jump
But-
in too, but you're not entirely right in this way. You're speaking,
It's good, I'm
we have-
partly right, that means.
No, we have long, couple things. We have a very long waiting list for people to get into, seniors to get into affordable housing. And I'm just going to mention.
Senior housing. And I
senior
think we've
housing.
created a stigma around the concept that there is a choice between affordable housing, as we know, comprehensive permits, and senior housing. And I just want to create a distinction that
Yes.
someday when I'm there,
There absolutely
I don't
is.
want senior housing, affordable housing to me as a senior to mean only senior housing. And today, we create a law which is supposed to be affordable housing under the broad brush of affordability from one generation to the other, but that's not really what we're creating. We're not creating an
We're
affordable...
not really creating
Affordable, yeah, that's
sustainable, affordable housing with 40B anyway.
But we're certainly not creating it
It's
for-
an infringement upon local communities, and
It's
it's
terrible.
not really
And that was
helping
my
all
other
those
point. Please
people
don't-
that we
Yeah.
think we're helping.
Right.
40B is something that is antiquated, is completely out of touch with the reality and the needs of affordable housing within the state of Massachusetts. It needs a complete overhaul. Do I think that a forced law such as 40B upon communities can work in an effective, real way? Absolutely. In its current form, no longer.
So if I were to say that, and that's my point of bringing it up, if I were to say that 40B in this community meant the next 2 or 3 comprehensive permits were for folks that are over 60, let's fix the number to 65.
Sure.
We would feel differently.
62, elderly
And so my
disabled.
point is, the
Totally
comprehensive permit
different.
process is not assisting whatever age we want to
Yeah.
tab to it, because the 65 is the new 55, I don't know.
But 40B...
Right? But it's not, I'm just saying, it was intended to cover that population as
Sure.
well. And it is just not a reality.
It
So
isn't.
we would all feel a little better about comprehensive permits in 40B if it afforded our own residents and our seniors an opportunity to find housing, and it's not doing that. That's my
No,
point.
you're
Right, it's
totally
not.
right.
Now
You're
you're-
not
yeah.
half-
Now you're absolutely right. Correct.
I'm leaving.
Well, we're moving to an agreement here, and we're watching the North Andover version of the McLaughlin Group. It seems to me that one potential tool that we could offer is if we allowed you to offer a density bonus for a senior housing development. That would be something we could all agree would be a good tool. Can I just go one step further? I'm sorry, Tracy. So just to go one step further, would there be a preference between rental housing and home ownership units, or would it not matter?
I don't know, we'd have to think on that.
Okay. Would you all do us the,
Well, you just said that you preferred it being blended, that's why I was,
So can we put that in the form of a request?
Yes.
We go back with a letter in
Right.
this month. Let's put that
if
in
you
there.
all would do us the favor, Mr. Chairman, of ruminating on that and thinking about what the most effective tool or tools would be, it would be particularly helpful if we could know that before the deadline of the 20th of January.
Well, we're gonna get that
And
to you then.
even if it's not a fully developed concept, the legislative process is intended to allow things to develop and evolve. So if we could have the basics of what would help you in that situation, I would dare say that this legislative delegation would be very interested in getting that process started, because we're sympathetic to the issue of wanting people to be able to stay in their homes. And one of the things that we can talk more about perhaps on another occasion are some of the tools that we already do have, like the property tax circuit breaker, which we all try to advocate for. One of the things that we've been trying to do as a delegation more recently is to update that, because as property values have gone up, some folks have fallen out of eligibility. And so they may own their home, but the home value is such that they don't qualify for circuit breaker property tax relief. And just to be clear, that circuit breaker property tax relief comes from the state in the form of a refundable tax credit. So when we change eligibility, we're impacting our budget and not yours, number one. And number two, for those who might be watching this and thinking about this, there may be many folks who are of such a low income that they wouldn't normally file a tax return. But with this type of a tax credit, you file the return even if you have no tax liability, and you get a check to help you pay for your taxes. So we should talk more about that, but I do think it's important, as we're having this discussion, to make sure that we all remember that there is that tool, and there's also the tool of the work-off for a reduction in taxes, and we've also looked at changing the amounts of that. So important.
I was going to say, and that, something you should cover in your senior meetings that you have, right? I'm sure you do, right?
So in
Yeah.
the CPC, there's also a reg that allows for an abatement process. I think the legislature, again, this goes to more local option, which is discussed by the board. Income strata, income means testing is done as a function of that. And I think it gets difficult because we establish these means testing standards and we think they make sense. You know, the world even 10 years later from when the CPC passed is not the world today. Right. And so, you know, we did some data to find out 49 folks had applied for that. We have 8,000 parcels in town. I mean, it can't possibly be the full extent of people who would be interested in taking advantage of quite frankly, the avoidance of another local option tax in the case of CPC. But I think the legislature should provide more tools in those cases whenever possible, and maybe if the board is interested, looking at that option to increase the threshold so more people could comply. There's a point in which we should need to be giving our seniors the opportunity to make decisions to help themselves instead of putting binders on those decisions and finding themselves in a particularly difficult situation because they're challenged between, you know, what we're faced with every day, right? Property tax versus food. I mean, who wants to be in that situation?
Or medicine.
Or medicine. So, whatever.
It's true. I think that
I'm off my high
the
horse.
only thing that I wanted to add was that, well, I want to say thank you to all four of you. It's been, I've worked with all of you for a long time, and you are an amazing delegation. We've been very, very lucky and very blessed in this community to have all of you. And at one time or another, all of you have helped me, this board, and this town, so thank you very much. And some of you, well, all of you won't get rid of me, trust me. So don't worry about that.
Nor do we want to.
But I think I just wanted to quickly just pivot back to 40B just quickly, that we often hear from the legislature, not you folks in particular, but in general, from state government, well, let's do an in-depth study, let's do an in-depth study. Let's do an in-depth study as to what those developments that have been built, in particular in the last decade under 40B, who are they housing? It's 10%. It's a 10% is all that's required. Affordable. What is that affordability? We know in this state, along with an opioid crisis, we have an affordable housing crisis too. And what can we do to improve it, to change it, to make it better? Again, it's 40+ years old. We live in a very different state and world with very different needs and a very different population.
Selectmen, I couldn't agree more. This delegation, if you remember a couple of years ago when you had the issue with the 40B housing project, had actually asked us to help with the 40B situation that was going on, and we did file legislation. So we all signed on to that. We all strongly supported it to help to reform 40B. The issue is that because, and it's unfortunate, and I know that we're all still pushing for this, and I have a similar situation actually happening in Methuen right now, which I've been working with Selectman DeCollegiero on as the chief of staff for my mayor, where we have a developer coming in and using that 10% threshold and picking a location, not really giving the locals the voice that they want in where it's going, how it's going to be built, what it's going to look like. And the community really doesn't have the input that I feel they should when any development comes into town. We all certainly agree that we need housing that's affordable. But those reforms that you're talking about are absolutely needed, and this delegation couldn't agree more. So I just want to encourage you and just say, I am optimistic that we are going to see some progression of some sort.
My take on it, though, is that a wonderful reform for me under 40B is a bump from 10% to 20% or 25% affordability within a development. That's progress in
Well, it's 25%.
it's 10%.
Oh, no, you're talking about the threshold number. the
No,
town has
a
to reach
40B is only 10% of the units built have to be affordable. Well, it's 20, it's,
Right.
yeah, it depends on,
It's
it's 10% in the
threshold.
community where you can stop, and 20% upon development. It's always tough to any community to get to that 10%. I mean, Beverly, there's only a few of them that are there, because as your population goes up, the 10%, it's hard to catch up. But as the population goes up, we're finding here in North Andover that, so many folks are priced out. But they're priced out of Haverhill and Methuen, some folks, too. So where are our folks going? They're crossing the border. Many. It's housing and opioids. Help.
Well, I'm just going to,
Neil, you have 2 more points,
right, and that was one of them. It's just a little bit different. And you all know how I feel about 40B. I've testified at the State House through Representative Lyons. The impact on a town like North Andover that still has land in comparison to a Swampscott or a Marblehead, they don't get hit like we get hit. We're still, we just are constantly being slammed. And one complaint that I'm getting more and more recently is growth, that the growth is too fast. It's putting a real pressure on the schools and providing, it's probably for other areas too, our seniors, everything. It needs to be redone. I mean, I've said it, so I'm not going to go on and on and on and on about that. The other thing, just really quickly, you talked about the foundation budget, and this might have already been addressed, that they used to draw a circle, and actually even Laurie might know part of this, circle around North Andover, and as to find out how much we have to pay our teachers. And if the circle, which went into New Hampshire, brought down the income. So my point is, a teacher who teaches in North Andover gets paid less than maybe another circle that doesn't maybe even include New Hampshire, and that doesn't get counted into our budget, which was our foundation formula, which is just ridiculous, because a teacher can get in their car and go over to another community. Like Westford was getting more than North Andover because of the way the circle went, the surrounding communities, and they'd go by the labor. Am I probably not making sense? Are you following me?
I have to excuse myself to make a call, but I would...
You understand what I'm saying, and I'm not saying it well.
There was a concept called labor market areas.
Yes.
And we're in a labor market area in this community that is not necessarily appropriate to the income level and to the other expenses in the formula for the area. And so there have been attempts periodically to change the labor market areas and to get them to more closely align with the profiles of the communities that they're in. But that's the issue, and I do have to apologize. I'll be right back.
Thank you for saying it better than I am.
Not with more passion.
You don't have to speak to it because we really have.
And
We can put that in our letter.
yes, in terms of a next step, don't feel that you have to write the legislation. We can place placeholder language in there so that we can refine it and get before the Housing Committee and add it to the agenda. So I think that just bullet pointing what is missing from 40B and from the housing debate will be helpful to us.
We have nothing to say.
Well, again, I want to thank you all for coming in. Time with us. I know it's been a long evening, so really appreciate you guys coming in. And for those of you who were just re-sworn in, congratulations, and great job to everybody.
Go home and go to bed.
Don't
The
tell
baby
Bruce
will
that we
be up.
ended. Let him stand in the hallway.
Yeah, we might have to take his packages with him.
Thank you for you.
All right, thank you very much.
Just got to give out Bruce's.
No, Laura said. She knew I'd be okay.
Thank you for coming in.
Picture of myself in front of the big mural. Oh, that right? My friend. You know the one in the high
She
school?
looked great.
Thanks,
And
Jim.
we-
Okay, so we're going to continue on with communications and announcements. Does anybody have any additional communications and announcements for tonight? Mike, Katie, thank you very much.
We have word that we're moving forward in some degree with the textile recycling.
Oh, yeah.
This is the good part of recycling, the textile recycling. We have signed the agreements with the vendor The vendor is in the process of accumulating up to 40,000 households. They have a number of communities due to vote this month. We were the first community in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to sign the agreement. The rest of the communities are coming through, so we're hoping by late spring, early summer, we will be delivering on curbside textile recycling.
Okay.
One thing, Dick, is Friday Bruce Law's name? Well, so we think.
It was, but that may change. I'll get back to
Yeah,
it.
but
I have told the board it was Friday, but
We are
there's,
thanking him for his service. He's done a great
Of course,
job for
Bruce is
9
great.
years.
yes,
Absolutely.
may change a week or so. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Tar. We appreciate your time tonight.
Last one in, first one out. Pretty good.
It's always a pleasure, and my
Thank you.
thanks, Tracy, for the partnership that we've had. It's been wonderful. We look forward to continuing to work.
Oh, you won't stop.
Oh, no. Just not from this desk.
I'm sorry?
Said I just won't be, blah, blah, blah from this desk. Or then, maybe.
There's an old saying that leadership is action, not position. And so titles aren't as important as
I like that.
There you go.
I like that.
Take care.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Tracy. That's
Okay, any other communications announcements? Hearing, seeing none. We're going to move forward. Let me ask, just out of respect for the audience here, is anybody here about the donations? Anybody here that has made a donation that is waiting for that to be accepted? Okay, so we're going to take those later then. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter into a public hearing to talk about the poll on Abbott Street. This is actually a continuation from our last meeting. So I'll hear a motion to go into public hearing.
Move to reopen the public hearing to receive comments on proposed National Grid and Verizon New England poll petition for Abbott Street.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so we have into this continued hearing.
Up in my head.
Sir, would you like to get up? I'm sorry, you have to reintroduce yourself and,
Good morning, almost.
yeah,
My name is Paulo Sattler. I'm representing National Grid, and I'm a designer for National Grid as well.
okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
He just said who he is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Could you just give me your first name again? That was
My name is Paulo.
Okay, so the last time we spoke, we had a kind of some discussion over how we would best implement the modification of the pole that is in the middle of Abbott Street. And I know we have a town engineer here tonight with us as well, who can speak to a proposal, or at least a design that that the town has come up with. But, let me, what, do you have a continued, or do you have anything to update us on?
Yes, the designer, Dave Boucher, met up with the engineer, I believe, at the town, and they talked about moving the poles and
Can you
modifications.
speak up just a little
Yeah,
bit?
Dave met up with the town engineer, and I believe with some of the representatives here, to discuss how they would put that pole there, if they needed to move it away from the wall was one of the things they wanted to do. The other thing, they wanted to install some berms at the two pole locations to prevent anybody from driving towards the pole or protecting the pole, but more protecting the person. And that's pretty much it. I believe they discussed. They just wanted to have a exact location of it and things like that. So I think from the last time that I was here, that's what happened. So after that, so.
Okay, so you have nothing to present at this point. But Mr. Borghese, did you want to come up? John Borghese is our town engineer, and I believe there's a proposal on the table on how to reposition this pole that will not be detrimental to the wall and
Yes.
get to the position that we need it to be.
Yep. So based on the last meeting and then a request from the town manager's office, the engineering department went out and performed a field survey because the nearby resident had some concerns of both the property line and then also, of course, their existing stone wall. So during the week of December 26th, the engineering department went out, did the field survey. We actually prepared a plan that I believe is in the packet, laying out just that, the property line, existing stone wall, existing features, and also the proposed location. Then when we looked at the plan and then working with National Grid, we developed a alternate layout where we actually slid the proposed utility pole to increase the distance from the existing stone wall, because recognizing the resident had serious concerns about the distance. So by sliding the pole, we provided now about 4.5 feet distance from the existing stone wall. It did mean we have to extend the curbing around that to protect the pole, something that the DPW could install, and then prepared the plan depicting that new location. I also went over the plan with the resident on Friday, just to show them our proposal where we increase the distance. I know Mr. Demers is actually here, but he indicated to me that, you know, he appreciated that we increase the distance, given his concern with the retaining wall. And again, we iterated, as identified on the plan, that the pole is in the right-of-way and not on his private property, which was one of his major concerns.
Are you looking for the drawing, Andrew? Is that what you're pulling?
Do you know that you're on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, he's looking for the drawing. So this is the drawing, this is the plan. This is the suggested plan for locating the pole. So it would be to extend a berm out from the sidewalk.
Exactly.
So it wouldn't be interrupting the sidewalk, and it would be further away from the stone wall, which of course we all want to see protected. So, and that would be a single pole that would service both the continuation of Johnson Street and Abbott Street, right? So that, the lines would go in both directions. And so, is that it, John? Is that what, okay?
Yes.
So why don't we turn it over, Mr. Demers, did you want to have any comments tonight?
Yeah, the meeting with John Friday, I'm fine with it.
You're fine with it?
Yep.
Okay. Does the board have any questions on the proposed layout or the
I
proposed
think it's
plan?
the best that we can do with a really awkward situation all around. I mean, it's just one of those things.
Right.
Just going to have to put lots of reflectors on that for the night.
Well, there will be it'll be a berm, right? So
Yeah,
there'll
but
be a raised area around it.
People expect the one in the middle of the road.
I don't know about that.
They'll always be
Well,
going.
they do now.
Well, they
You're
used
right.
to in this.
Well, if you've never driven down that road, you don't expect it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so, any other comments? Okay, so I'll hear a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so the public hearing is closed, we can take no more testimony on this. So, let's,
Move
Go ahead.
approval as outlined in the drawing.
okay, we have a motion, do we have a second?
Second.
All right, any comments or further discussion on this? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you.
Worth the wait, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about the wait.
Oh, that's-
We don't get those four in the room too often, so we kind of have to
Take advantage while they're.
take advantage while they're here. Okay, so moving next to consent items. We have a number of generous donations that have been made to our public safety, as well as to the Selectmen's breakfast that we recently had. So we'd like to have, I'd like to have some motions to accept these donations.
Do you want them done? Do you want to read them?
Yeah, I'd like to just recognize them. So I'll read them, and then we can, if you'd like to take a single vote. Okay, so first of all, Market Basket had donated $75 to our Selectmen's Breakfast, a gift card in value of $75 for the breakfast, so that we can, and the Selectmen's Breakfast is a breakfast that we as a group prepare for the town employees, the board members, committees, for the, anybody that services, volunteers, or works for the town is invited to join us. So Market Basket was generous enough to donate $75, as well as the North Andover Merchants Association was very generous, and they donated $100 so we could purchase eggs.
For
which
this
was-
year and next.
For this, yeah, so they've covered 2 years for us. And then we have some further donations for, and I'd like to understand what these donations are for. We have a donation to the police department from James and Maria Rossetti for $100. And that is not, any needed services or materials the department may require. So very general donation, but very generous as well. Thank you. And then Elizabeth Armstrong donated $500 to the fire department. Again, I believe for a general donation. Let me see what that was for. Emergency response team and our fire department of North Andover, so thank you for that. And then another $250 from the same person, Elizabeth Armstrong, to the police department for needed services or materials that they may require. So thank you very much to those. So I'll hear a motion to accept those donations.
Just before we make the motion, I know this was because it was money that was donated, but for the Selectmen's breakfast, we had Joe Fish in the Loft who donated the sausages. We had Heavenly Donuts who donated the pastry, so I don't want people to think that we did.
And fruit, and was it the Ganges?
And fruit from the Ganji family, again, for our volunteer breakfast, but, Lori, am I forgetting anybody?
Harold McFeeten donated his entire morning to
He did. He
being a
does a great
sixth
job.
selectman to help serve.
Yes.
So
But I just didn't want people to think we were, it's
No.
because we have to do it from money, but
Yeah,
the
there were
other,
a number of other donations.
the
That's a good point.
in-kind donations of gifts and of food and are certainly well appreciated as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, so do we have a motion? Was that a so moved?
So
Okay. It was a little
Second.
quiet.
so tired.
And do we have a second? Okay, all those in favor?
I
Okay, once again, thank you to those who donated both money and time and in kind.
Terrible.
Go ahead.
We're going to move to open a licensing?
Yeah?
Okay.
Open a license.
So we have a motion to to go into licensing. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Tonight's licensing hearing is pretty, or the licensing agenda is pretty light. We have Hokkaido back before us for a good reason. It's a change of management. They're changing their manager from Youngwei Ning to Sam Lee. The police have recommended this change and see no issues with this change of manager. I don't know if, I see that we have someone from Hokkaido here tonight. I don't know if we want to hear from them. You want to approach the microphone? If you just want to state your name and
Yeah, my name is Sam Lee from Hokkaido restaurant, owner.
and you'll be the new manager.
Yes.
Great. Yep. Yes, you are the owner as well, correct?
Yes.
Yep. I have no questions. I mean, I have none for you. I don't know if anybody from the board has any questions. Do I hear a motion to accept this change? Do I hear a second? All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Hearing none. Do I hear a motion to move out of licensing? All in favor? Aye. Here.
Okay, we're out of licensing. We have,
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Good luck.
Have a good night. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Okay, old business, we have no old business.
No.
We have no new business. Public comment. Q stand, public comment, no? Anybody else? No, okay.
Would you make the public town manager, I guess I'll do it on town manager comment, I guess, if we're
Yep.
town manager, something.
That'll be
segue to
next.
that, because I have nothing unless you have questions. Superintendent presented her budget at the school committee meeting last week. Decided to do it distance, by version of distance learning, watching it on North Andover GovCAM. I thought it was deep and thoughtful, learned a lot myself in watching it. I thought that was an interesting session where there was really, looked a little bit like a working session in a very positive way of the school committee. The superintendent has proposed a 4% budget increase consistent with what I've recommended and this board has supported. And the school committee has a couple of stops along the way, including a public hearing. I think there'll be some additional feedback at the next school committee meeting, then the public hearing, then the vote on the budget I would expect somewhere near the end of the month. But the presentation, for those who haven't had an opportunity, should watch it. It tells you a lot about what's happening in the school district, and it's well presented and consistent with what we expect moving toward the budget session in May. Town meeting.
Mr. Chair, can I revisit my decision?
Yeah, beyond public comment, but we'll give you
Courtesy.
We'll give you that courtesy.
Professional courtesy.
Yeah.
Only for a couple more months.
What?
I said only for a couple more months.
And then no more, right?
I just wanted to add to some of the comments from our legislative delegation. Certainly the Chapter 70 issue is big for the schools, a huge issue. But also circuit breaker, that was not mentioned, one of the subjects that consistently comes up. And that's, again, that kind of funding that comes and goes and can be very difficult for the school committee to try to budget around. So all of those, consistency there is what's really important. We'd like to have, of course, the right level, but having consistent numbers that we can really count on to budget to is really important. Getting this Chapter 70 formula right would be huge for education in the Commonwealth. I mean, it's just, it's awful for what it's doing to school districts in terms of the funding that we're all receiving. Now, again, having said that, we adjust the formula and there's no money, so what good would that do us? But hopefully people would see the light and start to fund the requirements. So that would be a really big help. Special education, insurance, as Senator Tarr pointed out, are the big issues for all of us. So those are things that we could really get great help from our legislature on, and to the extent that you all can help support us by also advocating for those things with them, it'd be great for the school committee, because those are areas where we could really use some consistent support and some consistent increases. And I appreciate, Mr. DeCollegiero, your comments about the CPA. It's done such great things for our town. To the extent that that would get even more funding, would just be that much better for all of us. Open space and historic preservation and affordable housing, all of the good things that it's done for us is great. And I would encourage you all, if you want to come, we're going to have, of course, a public hearing on our school committee budget in a few weeks. So, you could always come on down.
What's the date on this?
No.
It's let's see, the 12th and the 29th, probably.
Yeah, Thursday the 26th.
26th.
Right?
Okay.
It's our meeting on the 26th is going to be the public hearing. So if the public or any of you would like to come down and participate in that, we're happy to have you come on down. And there's, not only do we have the budget, but our superintendent took the opportunity to sort of lay out some forward thinking about where she sees the school department and our fiscal requirements going in the next few years. So I think that might be of interest to all of you too, to see sort of what her thinking is beyond this current budget. So I thought that we had as much discussion about that almost as we did about the budget, and that there are some areas there that you might be of interest in, of things we're thinking about doing at our middle school and at our high school, and a bunch of initiatives there. So that might be of interest to you. So I would encourage you to come and join us and listen in on the 26th. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Manager, anything further on your, okay. Hearing none? Hold on. Our next meeting is going to be January 23rd, 2017. Okay, now I'll hear a motion to adjourn. All right, do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Yeah, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.